Every product we pick up and service we use is a result of a complex global web of ships, planes, warehouses, technology and people that keep our world moving. That is until something goes wrong. And that's been happening more often in recent years, with increased geopolitical unrest, global trade policies, extreme weather, or even cyber attacks. So how do businesses stay resilient amidst the outside forces? Today we answer the big question: is it time to reset supply chains?
Resilience is all about how you can better recover and outperform your competitors in the face of disruption.
It became a really interesting question for businesses to say, does my supply chain continue to be a low-cost part of my business, or can it be a strategic differentiation?
You do it in a way which is responsible and sustainable. And at the same time, you learn from that disruption so that you can better prepare for the future disruptions.
Like, you're talking millions a minute in terms of impact for a lot of these companies. Like, the cost of that is just huge.
Hello and welcome to the Green Room by Deloitte. I'm Steph Dobbs and I'm joined today by my fellow co-host, Ollie. And supply chains might not be something that all of us think about daily, but they keep our world moving. From the avocados on our toast to the niche blend of coffee that sits on the table next to them. From the medicine waiting to be collected at the pharmacy to the smartphone that was used to renew the prescription. So what does a steadfast supply chain that can withstand an unreliable world actually look like? Do businesses need to be completely rebuilt or just innovate their existing supply chains? Today we answer the big question: is it time to reset supply chains?
Today we are joined by Dr. Alok Chowdhury, Professor of Supply Chain Management and Head of the Supply Chain Research Group at the University of Warwick. Alok, thank you for joining us in the Green Room.
Most welcome.
And we also have Sarah Noble, a partner and leader of supply chain transformation at Deloitte. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
So if we start off by looking at understanding supply chains as they are today, as we outlined in the introduction, supply chains are starting to feel the strain. And we're going to take a bit more of a detailed look at that in a little bit, but it would be helpful to understand what brought us up to this point. So Alok, how have supply chains evolved over the last decade, and how have our expectations as consumers driven those changes?
To answer your question, supply chains, the way you have explained, it's not failed. Supply chains have done what they were supposed to do. Our expectations have changed. The environment that we operate, that is changed, which is very much like VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Our shift in mindset from cost cutting to creating more value in the supply chain, that had changed. So supply chain needs redesigning, but it's not really needs completely resetting.
And I guess on that then, so as you say, the expectations of the supply chains are naturally changing. So Sarah, let's maybe talk about the fact that maybe once upon a time within businesses, it was often seen as, the logistics department, for example. Is that still the case in most businesses, or are we seeing supply chains more strategic from that business perspective?
I think to build on what Luke said, I think this is where the change has happened, right? So I think for 100 years, the supply chain was purely there to be the low-cost provider of a service into a business. And so that's not just logistics, but think about just having a warehouse, whatever it took to be really low cost, get the product out. And we didn't really think about the impact that had on kind of consumer buying behaviors. And as unsurprisingly, probably a decade, a little bit more now, there was disruptors in the market. And suddenly consumers were expecting things same day or within 24 hours. And that kind of changed not just things like Amazon, which is something, how we buy and how we have things delivered home, but actually it changed how we think about kind of everything in terms of how fast it comes out. And even if it's a business buying from another business, how fast you can get that. And I think that kind of disruption has changed and made, got faster and faster with things like COVID, et cetera, and ongoing disruption. But the reality of that is it became a really interesting question for businesses to say, does my supply chain continue to be a low-cost part of my business, or can it be a strategic differentiation? And that's kind of, I think, where a lot of businesses still aren't quite sure where they fall on that.
If I can add a couple of other things. So going back 10 years ago, we used to have supply chain measured on pretty much like cost, quality, service. Now, when we talk about today's world, you need to add other complexities like sustainability, Customers are increasingly looking for ethical, supply chain. You are looking for having an agile supply chain that can accommodate risk. And you are also looking for resilient supply chain, and that adds further complexity. So when we talk about even the board level expectations, board level, they would like to see less surprises, and less reputational risk, which supply chain often poses to many of the supply chain. So it's the change from that mindset of low cost, quality, and at the same time service providing, to adding more sustainability, resilient and agile supply chain, but also having less risk in the supply chain.
And if we dive deeper into that, because Sarah, you mentioned disruption within the supply chain. Alok, you mentioned resilience, and I want to touch on resilience actually, because that's remained topical in all areas of business, and we all know the word resilience, it's used a lot. But it's cropped up in a number of episodes we've spoken about, but what does it mean specifically within the context of supply chains? What does a resilient supply chain look like today?
We have done quite a lot of research on resilient supply chain, and there are hundreds of definitions. But let me break it down into very three simple steps and simple. So it's about your ability to prepare for a disruption, and then recover from that disruption, and at the same time adapt to the disruption. But it should not be a starting there. The leaders who are in supply chain, they think disruption as an opportunity. So you do not stop at where you don't want to go back where you were. Rather, you use disruption and opportunity, create value, and bounce forward. But the thing here is that you do it in a way which is responsible and sustainable. And at the same time, you learn from that disruption and so that you can better prepare for the future disruptions. So that's what we mean by resilient supply chain for a leading company.
When I talk to clients, I often say resilience is thinking about how do you give yourself some agility. So how do you make some investments now so that you have the ability to react faster, to react smarter, and so you don't feel the disruption as happens in the same way. But I think Luke is spot on, right? It is very much like, how do you prepare yourself in advance to know what might be coming? And the reality is we will continue to have things we don't see coming. So how do you actually invest now to give yourself the ability to make choices quicker and easier later down the line?
If I can add a couple of other things on the matter of resilience. Resilience, the underlying themes of resilience also cut across sustainability, the leadership, the supply chain leaders, but also your strategy. And often you will see that, in order for you to lead a resilient supply chain, first of all, the leaders need to be resilient themselves. Then only you can kind of absorb those shocks and reactions. But at the same time, going back to the very fundamental premise going on 10, 20 years ago, where we were talking about it's not the product which is competing against each other, but it's the supply chain which is competing against each other. So in that term, resilience is all about how you can better recover and outperform your competitors in the face of disruption.
And maybe on that point then, so thinking about current disruption, where it's coming from, a nice recent Deloitte report, so the 2026 Retail Industry Global Outlook by Deloitte found that 95% of businesses are expecting to see rising costs due to changes in global trade policies. So let's start there. That's obviously a massive concern for lots of businesses right now. Alok, I'll come to you first. How do changes in global trade policies and I guess geopolitical events more widely actually impact supply chains? Help us spell that out a bit.
Absolutely. So again, if you look at the cost, as I said, going back previously, we used to focus only on cost. Things have not changed significantly now. When we talk about the global trade, now supply chain needs to be designed in a way that can accommodate those costs. And sometimes what you will feel that in past we have outsourced pretty much a lot of manufacturing activities, for example, and we have predominantly focused on the unit cost of procurement. Going back to what we need to think of now is that the concept of that existed in supply chain for many years called total cost of acquisition, right? And that should actually not just talk about those geopolitical costs or trade costs, but also the risks that emanates from it. We have got increasing, regulatory commitments coming from government around scope 3 emission, which is specifically supply chain emission, which is not within our control. How can you take those factors into account when you are going to procure some materials? The problem that we see, particularly, a lot of industry, is that different departments, they operate in silos. So I'm not sure your experience, but I think if you talk about procurement, their whole intention is that how can I get the cheapest possible cost for my company, because their incentive is very much determined by that. But on the other hand, next department, which is, say, for example, pretty much focused on security of supply, their incentive is very much on how can I ensure that the part comes to the assembly line irrespective of any cost, irrespective of any risk, and they are willing to pay any price. So if you look at these two departments, not pretty much talking to each other, but willing to go by their own objectives, and that's where create a little bit of tension. So in this world, again, I think that elements of collaboration, internal, external, as well as taking into various factors, that is coming at a total cost rather than a singular cost for procurement. I think those are the elements we need to think of.
Yeah, 100%, right? Like, I think clients are very much facing that every day, trying to decide actually, one, we talk a lot about the silos of planning and thinking across that, and Alok just brought that to life perfectly. But I'd also say, like, they're sitting there trying to decide, well, actually, do I take advantage and think this is a growth opportunity because a new market is going to be underserved? Do we go after it? Or do I just need to think about how I cut cost and find a place where I can kind of like ride through what looks like continued uncertainty and a little bit of, probably not a little bit, a lot of disruption continuing to happen.
And something else we have seen in the news extensively recently are the number of cyber attacks that have affected some very well-known brands. Why are supply chains becoming such a prime target for cyber attackers, and what pressure do cyber security threats place on supply chains, Sarah?
I think this is a really interesting one, right? Because I think the cyber attacks that have happened at a lot of, as you mentioned, well-known companies, a lot of them didn't happen necessarily in the supply chain specifically. But so there's two ways to think about this. One, I think your supply chain, as much as it's been viewed as this low cost, the reality of something that stops your production line, like, you're talking millions a minute in terms of impact for a lot of these companies. Like, the cost of that is just huge. So it has a really big impact. The other side would be, actually, if we look at it, over the past decades, as much as supply chains have gotten a lot of attention, more so in recent years, bluntly, 10 years ago, my parents didn't know what I did, and now at least they have heard of it in the news. But I would say, actually, like, a lot of investment hasn't happened into, like, factory line machinery, into, like, the systems that are kind of running a lot of your kind of supply chains that have been the same for years. So the actuality is most companies haven't invested in thinking about cybersecurity for those areas either, because they're still running kind of old school green screen systems to run a lot of their production and their movement of goods. And that just creates kind of like the perfect place for cyber attacks to go after. And I think we see a lot of companies starting to smarten up to that. But, there's a lot of places to invest right now. It's hard to pick your top one.
Yeah.
And just to add on that, while we have seen a cyber attack on one of the leading giants in this industry in the UK, and government has to bail out their supply chain, that's a big alarm for us. If that can happen to them, it can happen to the suppliers as well, and the weakest link in the supplier where the impact will be maximum. And that's an area we need to kind of watch for, that how can we mitigate those cyber attack based risk in our supply base. And here I'm coming to other points, like in many of the cases we don't know who our tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers are. So going back to the 80-20 rule, your 80% of risk is coming from those 20% of suppliers that you don't know and you don't have visibility of, right? And those are the vulnerable areas which is to watch for.
And I guess maybe running alongside the threats and disruptions then, and Alok, you sort of alluded to this earlier, but is that expectation for businesses to make sure that they're maintaining sustainable and ethical supply chains as well? So Sarah, I guess what's actually driving those expectations? So how are organisations managing to sort of balance that long-term sustainability piece, but at the same time as responding to, I guess, the here and now disruptions that we've been discussing? How do you get that balance?
Oh, it's really interesting. That balance of like where are organizations really investing when it comes to kind of sustainability right now versus cost and or truly what customers are looking for in the market. I do think it's still in there in terms of how they're making some of their trade-off choices. It's the same in that lever of what is my profit, what is my cost, what's sustainability, what is my people impact. And it's great to be sustainable, but if you don't exist as a company, being sustainable is not particularly helpful.
I think you very much said the thing, sustainability is kind of not, it's not in a tension. Sustainability creates a big risk. So if you don't comply with, then you create that sustainability risk, what we call as ESG. But the fundamental premise, as you rightly said, that company needs to exist. So it should not compromise on those cost criteria or the being sustainable and at the same time having a very loss-prone company, right? So what it actually means is that the sustainability comes in multiple other ways that we need to look at. We need to look at sustainability from the reputational risk point of view, right? So if you think of what we call as sustainability risk, it's not what you are doing, but when things comes into the eyes of the stakeholders, right, whether it could be customers or whether it could be, NGOs, like that is where your major risk come from. Just to give you some statistics, like we have just recently, we analyzed 10 years of data of automotive industry, looking at different kinds of penalties that had been posed. And if you look at that data, it's massive. The number of regulations and non-compliances and the related penalties in automotive industry has grown exponentially. So my observation is this: you pay in one way or the other. Either you do it in a way that can make you sustainable, otherwise you prove yourself non-compliant to regulations or you void certain regulations and then you get penalty, whether it's from NGOs, and it might also come from your consumers who perhaps don't like the not having ethical or untransparent supply chain.
And I agree, but I also think the reality of that, if you use the automotive industry, is that they're in a really tough place now. Right? So they're struggling with profitability, they're struggling with the costs of making the investments in that. And so I think there has to be a balance, and I think organizations are desperately struggling to find that balance of how far they have to go to kind of pay those fines and make the investment. Because I think they do want to do it, and consumers do have an interest in it, but actually we're not doing any good for anyone, is kind of my point, if we put businesses, take companies out of business in order to reach that. And I think the reality is that these trade-offs are really hard. Like, no one's arguing that they aren't. But I think it's no longer like the top thing and only thing they're talking about. The reality is it kind of moves around.
Definitely a huge challenge. And sticking on the customer point you just mentioned there, Sarah, obviously at the end of every supply chain is a customer. And beyond the immediate operational and financial aspects and challenges that businesses face with their supply chain, what effect do fragile or disrupted supply chains have on the consumer experience and ultimately the brand's reputation?
I think it's really important, right? Like, I think more and more, it really depends on the industry you're in, I should say. So, but more and more, there's a huge swath of industries where the consumer will have a preference, but if they can get something else a day earlier, then they will switch in a heartbeat, right? And actually, many things, if you walk into your shop floor and what's available there, you'll pick over the one that's out of stock. And so actually, like, that has quite a big impact. And I think the reality is consumers have an expectation these days of having everything immediately, right? Whether that's information or products, whatever that might look like. And I think with that comes a real challenge for organizations, again, to just keep investing in the ability to do that. I think there's really interesting, there's an organization we talked to that was thinking about how do they invest in more information for, like, the minute a customer even like picks something up off the shelf, like of any product. So this could be a tin of biscuits. How do they know immediately back in kind of their planning space? And they might put it back down, but actually they're starting to gauge interest with that. They can think about where they market differently. Like, the amount of data we start to take into this and kind of match up to know kind of changes in the supply chain, but also everything around it is really kind of fascinating.
Do you think, just touching on that a bit more, do you think that consumers have enough visibility of, what a sustainable supply chain might look like and how that works end to end, or is there more education and an opportunity for businesses to showcase that more?
I think a huge swath of the population doesn't put a whole lot of thought beyond, is it available when I go to look for it? Maybe that's an unfair view, but I think there's a definite percentage of people who are putting real thought into the organizations they buy from, maybe for sustainability, maybe for other reasons, who are thinking about it and feel like a real brand loyalty that they kind of stick with. But I think there's also a huge swath of people who are, what's the lowest cost? And in these days, I think that group is growing, it's not shrinking. And so I don't think they understand everything that goes into the costs that they're facing and every part of kind of what goes into that and where it's from. But also it's complex because we talk a lot about things that, you talk about seed oils or you talk about other things that maybe people don't want in their foods, but actually the trade-off of other options, they also don't want to pay 10 pounds more for it. And so I think it's complex, and I don't think most people understand everything in it, but I'm not sure it's fair to expect them to either.
Do you think businesses need to be more transparent around that, I suppose, to help customers understand, I guess, to your point, all the complexities behind the scenes? I've seen some businesses now sort of trying to spell out why a price rise has happened, for example. A lot of small businesses are trying to do that, to say, I'm a bread baker, this is the cost of my oil, this is the cost of... Do you think that's something that businesses need to have a focus on, is articulating that and being transparent about what's changing?
You ask about whether customer have visibility. I don't even think that even suppliers have visibility of their own supply chain. Sometimes they don't know where their kind of, grains are coming from. If we talk about, say, for example, food supply chain or for example, palm oil and whole range of other things. So the NGOs has a big role to play. The biggest barrier here is that, what you don't want as a company, that tomorrow something comes into the news and the media suggesting that, hey, company X had its supply chain in Y, where there is a forced labor or child labor, and so on and so forth. So I think while, companies can try their best to mitigate those risks as much as they can, it will definitely help them to kind of, provide a little bit more information to the consumers. But that also comes with more risk, because if for some reason, if consumers find out from those other sources, whether it's through media or through other sources, you are in much more reputational risk in comparison to before. So there is a kind of trade-off that they need to make. There's no one size fit all sort of answer. It's the balance that really matters.
And if we're thinking about that around sort of building resilience and strengthening supply chains, then to your point, Alok, around, I guess, how do businesses actually evaluate and test their supply chains to find the vulnerable sort of spots, I suppose? How can companies do that? How can they test?
So there are a whole range of things that they can do, and going back to the definition that I provided, first and foremost is having visibility in their supply chain, knowing who your suppliers are. And I will give you some examples of a number of companies recently. They had in automotive industry last year, they have a flood in Switzerland-based company, and they work day and night with their supplier to make sure that, hey, we get their kind of, what we call as body in white as soon as possible. What they didn't realize that the same company was also their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. So while they were able to immediately mitigate their risk with respect to working with that company, but then they were tier 2 and tier 3 as well, and that's where they didn't focus on at all. So first and foremost is having that visibility of their supply chain, and it's not simple, it's not easy, it is not going to happen overnight, but the next move where we see the companies are leading the way is to know who your suppliers are, not just who your first tier, but also going down up to tier 2 and tier 3 and so on and so forth. And that will significantly mitigate your risk, because we now have so many techniques, say for example through artificial intelligence or machine learning, or even through digital twinning, which will allow you to risk sense well before actually it happens. You hold a lot of data about your suppliers that can enable you to predict those risks, that can enable you to kind of predict those vulnerabilities that might happen in the supply chain and alert you before it actually happens. The second thing is that talking about digital twin, it allows you to basically simulate those scenario. What if my supplier goes default, or what if the supplier is going through flooding, or what if the earthquake happen in a particular region? You are able to have those predictions well before those things actually happen. So yes, on one hand, risk has increased significantly, but at the same time, our technological advancement have also increased very significantly. That is empowering, senior supply chain leaders to make those informed decisions. So those are the ways to kind of achieving the resilient supply chain. Sustainability is a key part of it. As I have said, you have to have the responsible supply chain. And I think majority of the company, they do business responsibly. But as going back to the Sarah points account, that cost, resilience, it is not free. It's not coming up with free for now. So there is a balance that needs to be made. And if you are able to make that investment, that is going to stay with you for the future as well. You are making your supply chain resilient. So it's the decision that the supply chain leaders need to make, where there is a trade-off.
I think it's really interesting how this is an area that AI is going to massively impact, right? Because honestly, if you go back a couple of years, we had a lot of conversations with clients around how do you actually start mapping the tiers of your supply chain. What we mean is like who supplies who supplies that, and it can go like way down to like the mines where you get some of your minerals, right? And Luke's not wrong. Many organizations don't actually know all the layers of that. But actually pulling together that view used to be, quite honestly, like way too expensive for organizations to truly make the investment to do that. When, yes, there would be value coming from it, but the cost to trade-off was incredibly high. But actually, this is an area where AI and some of the different changes in innovations happening in that space, I think we're seeing really interesting clients. That's where they're starting to see some use cases and actually starting to see where they actually make some like really interesting trade-offs in terms of how they supply in like real-time supply changes based on kind of availability, based on where things are coming from, what's happening in the tariff world, all of that, and like doing it like, in the moment, which is I think that's where it gets really exciting.
For some children, especially those with complex needs, play is so much more than just fun. It's a lifeline. That's why we're proud to support The Yard in Glasgow and Edinburgh through our Social Impact programme. The Yard isn't just a play centre, it's a space where disabled children and their families can feel supported, build confidence and create lasting friendships in an inclusive environment. Find out how you can help The Yard continue their incredible work by going to theyardscotland.org.uk. And as we discussed earlier, changing global trade policies are quite a big concern for businesses right now. Sarah, how can businesses best keep up with this changing landscape and all of the regulatory change that goes with it? And are there any strategies you can share that businesses have deployed to manage these changes?
So really interestingly, I asked some of my colleagues before I was coming on today, and one of them was like, tell everyone about friend-shoring. So, we talk about near-shoring, we talk about offshoring, but actually there definitely is a move towards actually thinking about how you source from maybe countries and or kind of organizations and countries that specifically, have really solid geopolitical relationships. So you might see some of that start to happen, which I think is really interesting. There's definitely a bit of a mix back towards some nearshoring happening around a lot of organizations in terms of investment, because they feel like both it's security, but also they can have a bit more control over the costs that's associated with that. The other, I think this goes back to the resilience point that we covered earlier, right? I think it's about making investments now, or quite honestly, a year ago, that gives you the ability to make a decision in the day around kind of where you're shipping things, shipping faster, shipping slower, holding, going to a different direction. I think what's unfortunate is organizations where you're talking about like manufacturing, others, those are 5, 8, 10-year decisions they're making, right? They're not going to necessarily make a change on that within a day when a kind of tariff change happens or geopoliticals happen. But I do think we'll start to see organizations paused for quite a few months. That pause has stopped, and organizations are starting to realize they have to kind of do something to start reacting and giving themselves some more options.
Yeah. And now look, I guess maybe thinking then about how we manage this constant unpredictability that, probably in many ways, as Sarah alludes to, just exists now. That's the way the world is going. Things will constantly change. Would you say, how do businesses actually find that balance between stability and flexibility at the same time? Does it mean they need to strip out everything, start again in terms of supply chains? Or is it about taking what you've got and evolving? Any sort of tips to businesses?
Definitely. I think it's about, going back to that point around resetting the supply chain for the current world that we live in. And I think with the current world that we live in, you have got constant trade changes, we have got geopolitical tensions, you have got whole range of pressure coming from consumers, your ethical requirements and so on and so forth. Going back to the points that I said, around ethical requirements and sustainability. Now, how do you go about doing it? So there are multiple ways you can do. You can just sit down, be reactive as it comes, or you can become proactive, as Sarah said, invest in your supply chain and become more proactive with a view to future-proof your supply chain. And the leaders in the industry, in the supply chain industry, they are very much about future-proofing their supply chain, making the right investment, effectively collaborating with their suppliers, thinking of what are the regulations that might come up, that is still not there yet, but thinking of what are the regulations that might come up and what implications it might have on their supply chain. Thinking through all these questions is going to help these companies, and that is the environment that we have to think of, ensuring that transparency is there in supply chain, not from the angle of cost, but more from the angle of, when we talk about industry, it's around reputation, right? So how can we ensure that we don't have reputational risk as a result of not being compliant to a particular compliance or so on. So we just need to future-proof our supply chain with this emerging and changing VUCA world and whole range of constraints that's been imposed on us.
And Sarah, picking up on something that we haven't spoken about yet, is the foundational element to every supply chain, which is the workforce, the talent that sits behind the supply chain model for every business. What are some of the key considerations and impacts to the workforce and talent that we should be thinking about?
I think it's so important, and it's honestly a conversation I'm having pretty much daily with a lot of clients, because I think, you know, you'll hear us talk a lot about digitization and AI, and that makes some people really excited and it makes some people really nervous. And I think the reality of the supply chain is it is moving more and more towards what can be automated, to the point around like how do we actually kind of connect all the information in a really good way. And what that means is we will have less and less people doing kind of the repeatable jobs. And I don't mean less and less people necessarily in the warehouse, because you may or may not have warehouses that for a long time still will have people. But actually, we used to have someone who would kind of sit there and think, how many of those do I need? Well, actually, all of that is what's going to kind of more and more get automated in the background. And so it means that actually the workforce, both moving into leadership, but actually coming through, needs to be more and more strong at thinking about how do they solve critical problems, thinking about how do they use analytics differently. And I think, you know, when I came out of university, and I won't give myself an age with that, I would say it was really about like how do we think about the technology skills, whereas it's probably less about like the programming and technology at a core, and more about how do I use all the information technology is giving me. And I think that is a challenge around how do we actually kind of bring the workforce up to that and make sure both coming in, but also the ones we already have can transition into that, and it's a real challenge.
So, Alok, maybe I'll come to you on this one. When it comes to presenting to leadership, you know, return on investment and sort of showing the business case for building resilience, where do you even do that?
Absolutely, that's a very good question, and that is where a lot of boardroom decision makers just got stuck. It's very difficult to quantify in a way that you don't know what is the probability of a risk happening and what will be the impact of that risk on your supply chain, or more importantly, financially, when we talk about business case. So just to give you some excellent research done by Deloitte and some other consultancy companies, some big ones, and they said, you know, on average, for a large company, they have a loss of more than 150 million pounds a year, and 1% of their EBITDA. Losing that in itself is a big business case. But more than anything, I think the bigger risk is your reputational risk. What you don't want to do is to see in a newspaper like of BBC or others that, hey, my supply chain has been in trouble because there is, say, for example, child labor happening in different part of the world, or forced labor happening in different part of the world, or my supply chain is not compliant. As a consumer, I believe that as a company, it's your responsibility to control and to know your supply chain. That's what I believe as a consumer. But if that's not happening, and if you don't have visibility of your supply chain, that means that creates the biggest risk. And that risk will pretty much turn on you as your more reputational risk. So most of the procurement managers, it's simply about the key problem that is keeping them awake in the night, that tomorrow morning, I don't want to wake up with a newspaper saying that my supply chain was not compliant. So these combined things, like, you know, the losses that you make company-wise, plus the reputational risk, plus the loss of that consumer base, these in itself form the business case for future-proofing the supply chain.
Maybe if we take a step back and look at disruptions when they do happen to supply chains, what's that key to a successful recovery, do you think, Alok?
To my opinion, I think success comes down to having that effective leadership in supply chain. You know, you need to have a resilient leader, that only you can have, you know, resilient supply chain. So that's one thing. Success looks like it's pretty much focused on how the leadership can take that decision, sense those risks well before it actually happens, and being able to have some strategies in place through, as I was going back to the point that I mentioned, through what if scenarios, so that you can mitigate those risks, or at least try to reduce the risk as much as possible. The second thing that, again, going back to the point, is that we need to shift our mindset. You know, again, going back to mindset that I mentioned about previously only around cost, going back to the new mindset, which is all about creating that value for the consumers, for the supply chain, and so on and so forth. So that mindset needs to change. Also, we need to think of the long term, again, so that we can future-proof our supply chain.
I would just say, I think we talk a lot about the supply chain, right? And so the supply chain makes everyone think that we're talking about like just one steps along a single line. The reality is, the new world is more of an ecosystem, where, to the point around supplier relationship management and how you think about that, it's an ecosystem of your partners and all of that. So I think I fully echo that leadership is so critical, but actually truly having thought about and built out an ecosystem of both suppliers who become partners and collaborators, as well as all that, And thinking of that holistically, quite honestly, is I think the new world of success in a supply chain, both in the day-to-day, but actually in terms of how you react to any kind of true disruption that happens.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think thinking of it as an ecosystem rather than a linear
Exactly.
chain.
It's no longer a linear
right.
chain. Like there is no linear in the world of supply chain anymore.
Really interesting.
So I suppose actually we're finally starting to come towards a close. So I suppose maybe if we could ask each of you for one piece of advice that you'd give to businesses that they should focus on improving. One each. Sarah, let's go to you first.
So I think it's give yourself the ability to make more real-time decision making. And so I think that is everything from, we talk about kind of a single digital thread that goes through kind of your entire organization, and truly think about like where you invest to give yourself that capability. And that's from planning into kind of where you are shipping and where things are in their kind of movement of logistics, warehouses, production. I think give yourself that digital thread to kind of pull everything together, and it gives you the information in real time to make hopefully a fast, smart choice.
Alec?
I think one piece of advice very much overlapping with what Sarah has said is to do with, you need to value resilience, you need to value sustainability, but at the same time, you also need to ensure that you have visibility of your supply chain, not just tier 1, tier 2, but also up to what extent you can be transparent in your supply chain. And just leading that to that AI provides so much of opportunity these days so that you can have data-driven decision making. So again, just valuing resilience, sustainability, and investing in your organization and in supply chain.
Great. So to answer the big question as we wrap up completely, is it time to reset supply chains? Sarah, I'll come to you first.
I think if you haven't in recent years, yes, it's the time to definitely take an opportunity to maybe not fully reset, but at least reinvest and think about that strategic role.
Definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely the time to redesign supply chain based on current priorities, the world that we live in, making our supply chain compatible to the world we live in, not the world which we have left before. So that's, to me, is the reset of supply chain.
Great advice from you both. Well, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We release a new episode every other Tuesday with another big question. So don't forget to hit follow or subscribe to this podcast, wherever you're listening or watching. And make sure your notifications are on, so that way you'll be alerted whenever a new episode drops. This podcast is produced by our very own Pod Squad. Original music by Ali Barrett.